Hey guys, we're going to be setting up Redux. So when we click our buttons in our app, we're going to be managing the state and keeping track of what buttons have been pressed with Redux. So before we get into installing Redux and setting it up, I want to make a quick change to our buttons here. The first is the background color of the buttons. I want to make them F2 instead of FA, just so they show up a little bit nicer with the white borders. And then also, right now we're using a view as the background, but we want to make these clickable, or pressable. So instead of using a view component, we're going to use a touchable opacity component. It sounds kind of weird. All that is a view component that can be touched. So touchable opacity, and you'll notice no visual change over here when we add this. Let it refresh. But when I click it, notice how we get that nice little fade on there. So now we can actually pass a on press to this. So we're going to pass as a prop on press to our button. Now if you've done React before, you're probably used to on click. On React Native, it's on press is the function. So on press is called whenever one of these is pressed. So for example, on press would be called there. So now in our app.js over here, we can specify what we'd like to see when a button is pressed. Okay, so we have that set up. We can start setting up Redux. So first thing is to install React Redux and also Redux. So this is the library, and then React Redux helps us use Redux in a React environment, because you can also use Redux in Angular, Vue, and other libraries. Okay, make sure to npm install that. I already ran this, so I'm not going to run it right now. When you have that installed, what we're going to do is get it set up. So now to set this up, usually you create a store, and then you wrap your app right here in what's called a provider tag. And then after you wrap in a provider tag, you can connect components to the Redux store. We have a small problem. If we want to add a provider tag to our app, we can't connect our app, because the provider component is not around it. Now this might not make sense, but what we're going to do is create a new, we're going to rename app.js to main.js, and we're going to create an app.js, and what app.js is going to do, we're going to import main from /main, and here we're just going to export default a function, and what our function is going to be is our main app. So if we don't do anything, this should here, import React from React. So all I did was create a new file called app.js, and that calls my main.js, right? So we should see the exact same thing over here. The reason why I'm doing it like this is we can now initialize Redux in here. So now I can say import create store from Redux and import provider from React Redux. So we want to wrap this thing with a provider tag, and provider just gives us access to the Redux store. So that's why I wanted to wrap this main with this provider, and I couldn't really do that if I just had one app. So this provider, what it does is we're going to create a store. So const store is going to be equal to create store. We're going to go over how to create the store. We're going to have to pass a parameter, but you pass store in here, and this is going to be your Redux store. So a Redux store here, we don't have a function, so it's, we'll fix that in a second. I just want to explain what this provider thingy is doing. So when we set up our store, we're going to pass it to a provider, and then any components inside of the provider now have access to the Redux store. So my main.js can access the Redux store, and the way I do that is by importing connect from React Redux. So this is a special component. It's called a higher order component, and what I can do is I can wrap my app, this guy right here, I can say connect, and we're going to pass some parameters to connect, which we're going to get to. But when we pass some parameters to connect, we actually are going to get passed as properties to our, or props to our app, the value of the Redux store. And then we can actually render what's going on in the store here. And this will make more sense as we fill this stuff out. So let's get started with that. So let's create our store. Now, how to create store works is there's more parameters you can pass in, but we're going to keep this very simple, and the only one we're going to pass is our main reducer. So I'm going to create a file called reducer.js, and we're going to import. We don't need to import anything. I'm just going to export default. We're going to have one function that's going to be our big reducer. And in our main, no, we don't need to touch our main in our app. We're going to import reducer from /reducer, and we're going to pass in reducer here. So there's these things called reducers in Redux, and all reducer is a function. So we're importing reducer from /reducer, so that's this guy right here, and he is going to be a function. So this is a special function though. How it works is it takes the current state and an action, and then it's going to return the new state based on what the action is. So action is a special. This guy is a special because he is of the type. He has a type, which is some constant usually, and then he's going to have a payload, which is an object with like data in it. So we're going to change the state in different ways depending on what the type is. And we actually create these actions, which I'll show you and we'll get to in a little bit. So we're going to create a switch statement, and we're going to say action.type. And we're going to do different stuff depending on what the type is. So for example, the type could be Bob, and maybe we return an empty array like that. And it doesn't like it. Oh, I need to use case default return state. There we go. So here is what a reducer looks like. Let's get this rendering right now. So I'm gonna get rid of connect on app right now because we're gonna add that in a second. And state, there needs to be a default state. For us, our default state is going to be an empty string. I'm going to be changing this later, but this is just going to show you how Redux is working. We'll just say state there too. Let's see if this loads now or if we have any errors. Okay, so our default state is an empty string, and to just demonstrate to you guys how Redux is working, since we have it set up now, I want to click this button and I want to see the numbers appear here. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to create an action. So, and you know what, I'm going to create it in this file. So I'm just going to call this I'm going to call this file like action reducers, maybe just like modules, and I'm going to say export const reducer, and then up here I'm going to add my actions. So now in my app.js, we're going to add curly braces, and we're going to get this from modules. So now my module folder will have a reducer in it, but it's also going to have actions. There we go. So I'm going to export const I don't know, what do we want to call this? Type number maybe? Type, press number we'll say. Press num, keep it short. Okay, so what press num is, this is going to be an action. And press num can take some variables here. so maybe the number, right? And so I'm gonna just call this the payload. It's gonna be the number, and the type, I'm gonna create a const press num is equal to press num. So the type is called press num, and then the case here is for case press num. Okay, so now when I call this press num action, what happens is I take a number and I'm returning an object with the type press num, and the payload is going to be whatever this number is. So now whenever I get to this case press num here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the current state, and I can deconstruct this action, right? Because we know it's going to have a type and a payload. So now our payload is going to be whatever number was pressed. So here I'm going to say state, and then we're just going to add on to the state whatever the payload is, whatever the number is, because our state is just a string. So I'm basically adding to this string. This looks pretty weird. We could also just say return state plus payload too, right? I'm just using string template there. These should do the same thing, I believe. We'll put this because it's a little simpler. Okay, so now I need to call this action whenever I press a button, and I need to show the state here in our app. So to show the state, I'm going to use connect. So connect has two parameters. The first is called map. It takes two functions as parameters. It might take more, I'm not sure actually, but I've only really ever used the first two. So the first one says it takes the state and you map state to props. And the reason for this is if I want to call this something else, like for example, I can call this current number, and it's not happy with me. State is not defined but never used, and we're just going to return current number. It's going to be a state. There we go. So now can't find variable, current, reload. Cool. So now in our props over here, we're going to have current number passed in. And so now I can render current number here. Current number. Alright, so notice how the current number, we see nothing here. And that's because our state is nothing. So if I were to add a 0 here, we should see our default state as 0. And this is 12. We should see 12 there. Because what's happening is in our app over here, I'm grabbing the current state, right? Because that's state, and then all we're doing is we're saying what we want to call the state. I'm calling the state current number, and we can manipulate this in any way we want to. So I'm calling it current number, and then I'm grabbing the current number in my app, and the reason why this is in the props is because I'm using this connect right here. Okay, so I grabbed that here, and because we haven't done anything, haven't shown anything, we're just grabbing the default state. And that's why it's important to show default state. Now we'll just set the default state to 0. And so now when I click a button, what I'd like to see is I want this action to be called, and I want this operation to occur. We take the current state, which is 0, and then we add whatever payload we call with press number to it. So the way we do this is we're gonna, in main, so we added an on press to this button here. So really I want to say on press, and when on press occurs, I would like to call this action, press num. So what we're going to do is we're going to import press num from /modules. And it's just mad at me because this. So you might be thinking, oh, we can just, type in here press num, right? But this won't do anything, right? Nothing's changing, and the reason for that is all press num returns is an empty object, or not an empty object, but an object with type and payload. So you can't just import the action here and call it. So this is just a function, and we call them actions. I don't know if I explained that earlier, but it's just a function here. You can't just call it. What needs to happen is you need to dispatch. So there's jargon that they use in Redux called dispatching, and what that means is you take this function and the return value of it you pass to the modules over here. So I want to dispatch this action, so this is passed to our reducer. So to dispatch it, that's our second parameter to connect. This is called, we given a dispatch function, and I like to use a special function that Redux gives us called bind action creators. So Redux bind action creators, and I like to call that here bind action creators. Dispatch is the second parameter. So what does this guy do? So what this guy does is this function takes an object of all your actions. So the action I would like to bind is this guy right here, press num. And what I'm doing is I am adding dispatch to it. So when I call this function now, the one that I passed to the props, and I need to rename this guy. So I'm going to call this press num with dispatch, for example. So this is going to be passed as a prop now. Press num with dispatch, and we can put it right here. Press num with dispatch. So because we use this bind action creators function and we passed in our dispatch, so there's a function here, we can add as many actions as we want in this, but we're binding this press num, right, with dispatch. So now when I press 9, it should call that action, and it doesn't. Bummer. Or maybe it hasn't reloaded yet. I was thinking this was going to work, but what should happen is when I press this number, it should call our reducer, and we should see state plus the payload updating. Okay, cool, we do. Only problem is payload seems to be not what we think it is. Oh, on press. We just need to change our button. So on press, really what we want to do is when on press is called, is pass the text, right? Yeah, I think that should work now. So we call the function they give us, passing the text they give us. We could also do this over here, I suppose. Yeah, either way would work. Well, let's save that. 9. Okay, cool. So now it does work. So as I click 9, what's happening is this action is getting called, and it's saying type press num payload in. It's getting passed to our reducer. Our reducer takes the current state, which is 0 at the beginning, but grows, right? So at the beginning it's going to be 0, but then as I press 9, the payload or the state increases because we hit this case, and we're going to return the state, which is going to be 0 plus a 9 attached to it. Then the next state is going to be a 0 and a 9, and like this is the current state, right? So I can just keep attaching 9s to it. So now what we're going to do is just add this to our couple buttons here. So now 9, 8, we can click any of these guys, and we see as we're clicking the buttons, our state updates. So this is just a quick overview of how Redux is working if you've never used it before. Maybe that confused you more, but take a look at the code. The basic jargon to recognize yourself is this function that controls what value is seen here is called a reducer, and this guy is involved in touching the state. Now, important thing about this I forgot to mention is you cannot mutate the state. If you've never heard of mutating, that means changing, or basically you don't want to say, here we want to return a new value for it, right? We don't want to say state is equal to 92 and then return state. That's not what you want to do. You want to create a new value, and that's what we're doing here. Make sure it's immutable. Yeah, so to expand on this, we're going to be adding more actions. We're going to be changing how our default state is, and then we're going to be incorporating these. OnPress doesn't do anything right now with those guys, but we're going to be incorporating more of these buttons doing different stuff when buttons are clicked based on what our current state is. That's it for this video, guys. I hope this was helpful with Redux, and then in the next one we'll continue on and actually start adding and doing more stuff with this. But thanks for watching.